What is up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Courtside here on the Basketball Network. I'm your host, Caleb, and as always, I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Connor. Connor, how are we doing?
Doing good today, getting excited for this episode. I know we've kind of hit the NBA hard the past couple weeks, but I think we got some good stories relating to college today, so I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm really ready for this one. I know, as you mentioned, we've been talking a lot about the NBA, but just ready to get into college basketball as well. And before we jump into the episode, just quickly wanted to mention thank you to everyone that's been listening so far. And if you could do us a big favor and just drop a like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube or if you're on any of the podcast platforms, make sure to give us a 5-star rating. We really appreciate it. But before we jump into college basketball, this past weekend was week 0 of college football. So really just wanted to get your take on what the games look like this weekend, if you watched any, and what you think is going to be for the upcoming season.
Yeah, I think there's three pretty exciting games. It was an amazing way to kick off the college football season. Unfortunately, I didn't get to watch them live. Connor sadly had to work all day, um, but I was keeping up with them. Watching some of the highlights. But yeah, it's looked like we had obviously one major upset and a couple from come behind wins that ended up being really exciting.
Yeah, and that major upset was crazy. If I do say so myself. So that one would being the Florida State and Georgia Tech game, actually all the way over in Ireland, which was where College Game Day was as well. And I got to catch a good bit of that game. And if you didn't know, Florida State was actually ranked 10th coming into the season, going up against an unranked Georgia Tech for the first kickoff of the college football season. And Georgia Tech actually came out and upset number 10 Florida State with a last-second 44-yard field goal. And it just felt like this was just one of those things where it kind of rolled off from last season for Florida State, not making the college football playoff and then losing on a last-second field goal to start this season. Just a tough way to start the year. And they had a new transfer quarterback, DJ U, there, and he just struggled passing the football. There was this crazy stat where his average passing yard attempt in the first half was negative zero point 0.7 yards. So basically everything was just thrown behind him, and then any yards they were getting were just receivers running down the field or running backs running down the field after they caught it. But that was a crazy one. And then we had a few other comebacks with Montana State and SMU.
Yeah, I was obviously Montana State was probably the pretty big underdogs heading into that game against New Mexico. But obviously it looked like New Mexico was going to run away with it, but then they ended up scoring 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. And ended up winning that game 35-31 with 10 seconds on the clock. I mean, it really doesn't get more exciting than that in college football. Obviously, not two top teams, but you just got to get excited, man. Just the college atmosphere is back. I know you, like me, are just huge college fans of sports in general. I know we love that passion, and I feel like that was just kind of the vibe this weekend, which is that passion was back in the sports.
It really was. And the last comeback, as I mentioned, was SMU over Nevada. And SMU was down 11 points at the end of the third quarter and then ended up making Nevada score 0 points the last fourth quarter, and they scored 16 unanswered, including a safety in the fourth quarter to come back and win. That was a big win just with this season being their first year in the ACC. So it looked like the ACC might have been down bad at the beginning with Florida State losing, but obviously SMU coming back just kind of brings some hope back into the season. But enough about football. That's not what this podcast is about. We're here to talk basketball, and today, as Connor mentioned, we're going to be talking a lot of college hoops. But first, we're going to jump into our Transition 3 segment. So just 3 quick stories that happened this week in the world of basketball that you might want to know about. So first one is kind of a sad one, a bittersweet one. So Goran Dragic, so an NBA star, he actually had his farewell game where he was basically saying goodbye to the game of basketball. And he did this in a charity game titled The Night of the Dragon, which is his nickname. And this included some of his former teammates and other NBA stars. So it was really cool to see Goran Dragic and some other NBA stars playing in this charity game all the way in his home country of Slovenia. Some of these players included Chris Bosh, Steve Nash, Dirk Nowitzki, Nikola Jokic, Boban Marjanovic, and actually the other team that Goran Dragic was playing was actually another Slovenian player, Luka Doncic, and a bunch of other NBA stars. So it was just really fun to see. But Connor, really just wanted to see what your take was on if you saw any of the moments on social media or anything like that, because it looked like a bunch of these guys were just having a really fun time.
Yeah, obviously it's definitely pretty cool to see these players in just a different environment. You know, not really a competitive environment. You know, they're just out there having fun, honoring, a extended career for the Dragon. You know, he's kind of just one of those players that, like, I feel just no one hates this guy. You know, like, everyone respects him. You know, he was going to go out there and compete every night. But I think you hit it on the head. It's definitely a bittersweet moment. Honestly, and then it was definitely a bittersweet also to see Chris Bosh out on the floor. He originally wasn't gonna play, but then he ended up, watching them out on the court, and he decided I'm gonna get a couple minutes in. Um, just being a Dwayne Wade fan, obviously Chris Bosh was a big part of that big three in Miami. Just amazing career that was cut short by, medical necessities that required him to retire. So definitely a bittersweet to see Dragic, his retirement game, but also I think just everyone was happy and also sad to see Chris Bosh out there.
Yeah, and it was just a great way for it to end. For those of you who don't know who Goran Dragic is, just quickly, he was a second round pick back in the 2008 NBA draft, but no one really thought much of him coming into the league. But he actually stuck around and played in the league for 15 seasons, which is a pretty long career. Was the NBA's most improved player in 2014 with the Phoenix Suns, and actually made an All-Star appearance with the Miami Heat in 2018, and then basically owns all of the Slovenian basketball records, which might not hold for long with Luka Doncic coming, but just a really cool way to see that end. And as you mentioned, Chris Bosh getting back on the court, a bittersweet end to his career as well. So it's just a great way to see those guys, and then obviously it was for charity, so always fun to see. But another legend of the game, this one on the women's side, happened this past weekend. So on Saturday, Maya Moore actually had her jersey retired by the Minnesota Lynx. And this is for her as a four-time WNBA champion, and for some people, the GOAT of the WNBA. So that was a pretty cool moment to see for Maya Moore out in the Target Center up in Minneapolis.
Yeah. I know a lot of people probably started watching the WNBA past couple years for obvious reasons, but I always felt like when she was in the WNBA, if you heard the term WNBA or women's basketball, there's a good chance you thought of Maya Moore. I think even as short as her career was, I think it was only like 8 seasons, the amount of awards she collected in that time is just incredible. I think she's one of two WNBA players to win Rookie of the Year and a WNBA championship in the same year, which is just outstanding. Yeah, so definitely a bittersweet moment. I know she retired to pursue other interests. She felt like she had a different calling, but I mean, I definitely think that they did right by her.
For sure, and they ended up getting the win against the Indiana Fever and Caitlin Clark in that game. So a great way to cap off a perfect night for Maya Moore, and she actually mentioned that she didn't want that night to end. But I'm going to quickly read off her accomplishments because, as you mentioned, they are insane accomplishments for someone that's only played 8 seasons. So keep in mind, Maya Moore only played 8 seasons in the WNBA, but she was a four-time WNBA champion, 2011, 2013, 2015, 2017. So every other year, Maya Moore was the WNBA champion, and she also made it to 6 different WNBA finals. So 6 of her 8 years, the Minnesota Lynx were in the WNBA finals. She was the WNBA most valuable player in 2014, finals MVP in 2013, a 3-time All-Star Game MVP, 2-time Olympic gold medalist. She won the scoring title, and then as you mentioned, Connor, she won the Rookie of the Year. And the last thing I want to mention about Maya Moore is she was actually kind of one of the best WNBA players of her generation. And this was seen because she was signed by Jordan as basically being the face of the WNBA for the Jordan brand. So you had Michael Jordan obviously being the face for the men's side, but then Maya Moore, whenever she got signed by the Jordan brand, was kind of the face of the women's side. So just really cool to see that she got her flowers there, and they were able to pull out the win at the end of it.
Yeah, definitely a amazing night for her.
For sure. And then the last story we want to mention actually just broke earlier today. So Cooper Flagg signs a deal with New Balance to become the new face of the New Balance basketball line. And Connor, really wanted to see what your take was on this, because obviously all of the brands are pursuing him, just being one of the biggest names in high school and soon to be college basketball. So what was were you surprised by the signing with New Balance? Do you think he might go somewhere else, or what was your thoughts on it?
I mean, obviously, I think it's definitely a little surprising. It's not just completely surprising just because the past few years, New Balance has really made a push into basketball. Obviously, Kawhi Leonard signed with them a few years ago. But, recently they've signed Tyrese Maxey, Jamal Murray, Cameron Brink. I'm not sure if y'all saw that commercial before the Olympics came out with all of them and a couple other of their star athletes that they have. Um, but yeah, obviously, I think this is probably the biggest signing they've had just because Cooper Flagg is projected to be the number one pick. Definitely a major grab for them.
For sure. And one thing I kind of saw this equated to on social media earlier was this signing of Cooper Flagg to New Balance could be similar to the signing of Steph Curry and Under Armour for basketball. If you remember back when Steph Curry signed with Under Armour, everybody was just kind of like, what are you doing? Under Armour does nothing in the game of balance. And obviously, New Balance has some stars, which Under Armour didn't have. But with the amount of hype around Cooper Flagg, I can just see this elevating New Balance's game to the next level in terms of the basketball market. Cooper Flagg just signed on to play with Duke this year, and he'll be a freshman. But as Connor mentioned, he's the number one prospect, not in this next year's NBA draft, but the following year. And then he is just going to be someone who does absolutely everything. So Cooper Flagg averaged 17 points, 8 rebounds, 4 assists, 4 steals, 4 blocks in high school for Montverde Academy, leading his team to an undefeated season and winning the national championship and winning National Player of the Year. So this is just a huge signing for New Balance, and I think it's just going to kind of push them into that next level, which will be really cool to see.
Yeah, I mean, and I am kind of interested to see, like you said, will this help push New Balance? Just because, even with their big NBA players they have right now, you don't really hear about people being like, oh, I'm going to go buy these New Balance basketball shoes. Or, they're just not a big name in basketball. So I definitely wonder if it's going to help elevate them.
Yeah, I agree, but I do think New Balance can be kind of like how Reebok was when John Wall first signed on. I don't know if you remember, but it was like the first year or two that John Wall signed with Reebok. Like, it was, everyone wanted those shoes. I even got a pair because of who John Wall is. I just feel like Cooper Flagg can be that guy, especially after what we see this upcoming year in college basketball. I just think he's going to be absolutely insane, and in my opinion, a first-team All-American, but we'll get to that a little later in the show.
Yeah.
But I think that's enough about the transition three and some of the stories. Really just want to jump into the meat of what we're going to be covering here today on Courtside. So as Connor mentioned, this one's going to be tailored and focus a lot around college basketball. So we got some really big news recently on maybe UConn's going to be joining the Big 12 with talks ramping up about that. Also discussing a preview of what college basketball is going to look this year, some of the teams we like, and what our expectations are for that. And then lastly, we're going to be going over some of the multi-team events and tournaments, things like the Maui Invitational Battle for Atlantis, and this new Players Era tournament that we haven't seen before, so you won't want to miss it. But jumping into the first piece of news is UConn. There are reports that UConn is going to be joining the Big 12. So this has come from multiple different media outlets, but basically the Big 12 and UConn are in talks about the Huskies joining the league in all sports. But one thing I want to mention about that is there is a caveat. So the addition would be for all sports besides football, but that would happen as early as 2026, with football being delayed until 2031. Connor, what's your initial thoughts to this news?
Man, I think that is insane that this is even in talks. Um, I think definitely there's been a lot of talk of just considering UConn a blue blood, you know? I mean, 3 championships in the past 10 years. Um, yeah, I think this is especially big for the Big 12, especially we've seen the past few years them kind of, you can argue that they're the best basketball conference in the league. I think it's pretty close between them and the Big 10 right now. But I think this addition of UConn would really elevate them into that big spot as the number one team. Especially if Dan Hurley just, if he's staying there, I think that's huge for the Big 12.
Yeah, and I'll just to go off of that. So UConn's athletic director and one of their board chairs actually met with Big 12 athletic directors this past week in person in Dallas, and one of their topics of conversation in those meetings was this is gonna push the Big 12 from being the best basketball conference to the undisputed best. I mean, if you add UConn to this already just gauntlet of a basketball conference that is the Big 12, there is no question that that conference is undeniably the best conference in the nation in terms of college athletics and basketball. But the one caveat to this whole conversation, and I think what is kind of holding these talks back and why they didn't gain any additional momentum in the last year, was this conversation around UConn football. So for those of you that don't know, UConn football has not had a winning season, or I think they've only had one winning season in the past like 10 years. Every other year, basically, they've won like 3 games. Last year, they won 3 games, and they're actually not in a conference for football, so they're an independent school, meaning that they don't play anyone every single year. They're just kind of picking and choosing, making their schedule, similar to how UMass and Notre Dame do it. But the Big 12 is a little hesitant on signing on UConn because they know they're having to take on that football school, and it's not really bringing anything to them. So I really want to hear your thoughts on, the basketball versus football side of things, because we do know in this world and how college realignment is happening, it's really all about the football in terms of the money and the money talks.
Yeah. Obviously, if you're UConn, you want your football team integrated, like get in on those media deals with the Big 12 that they've signed. But I think UConn really needs to look at it from the Big 12 perspective, because it's not like it's just an absolute no from them. It's, hey, let's delay this, give y'all a chance to build up to become a team that can compete in the Power Four. Because if if you're the Big 12, you're already on the like having to argue with the Big 10 and the SEC that, hey, we still belong here. That we're just as good as y'all. And adding a team like UConn's football team, you just got to face the facts. It's going to drag them down. Um, so obviously, but UConn wants them already integrated. Um, but I just can't see the Big 12 agreeing to that just because of that. But I feel like their basketball team should be enough for them to be like, okay, like let's join.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think UConn is definitely all for it. That's why they're the ones, presenting at these meetings. And honestly, the Big 12 commissioner, Brett Yormark, is all for it as well. We've seen last year when he was going after UConn initially and going after Gonzaga, he wants to expand and bolster up the Big 12 as the premier basketball conference in the nation. I also think he's looking to expand over into that New York City, that, Northeast, like time zone time frame, just really to kind of get to where the Big 12 is pulling from all different parts of the country. And he wants to actually, this has been reported, he's interested in actually separating out the media rights packages between football and basketball. So in college sports, we all know football is what makes the money and what makes the most money. But Brett Yormark, being the businessman that he is actually looking at, yeah, we can sell our football rights to these networks, but our basketball rights, being the best basketball conference, is very valuable as well. Let's look at maybe expanding these and selling these to other networks as well, just where we can, make it as the most lucrative for all of our schools. So that's one thing I really want the Big 12 to consider when it's talking about taking in UConn, is really thinking like, yes, this might hurt us on the football side of things, but we're giving them additional years until 2031 to get better. But when it comes to basketball, I mean, you already got Kansas, Baylor, Houston, Iowa State, Texas Tech has been good recently. I mean, all of these different schools that are already at the top of the game, and now adding the back-to-back national champions going on a three-peat in the UConn Huskies, and especially with Dan Hurley turning down the Los Angeles Lakers job to stay with the UConn Huskies. I mean, for me, it's a no-brainer, but again, we're doing a basketball podcast. I'm all here for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you hit it, right on the nose. I think the Big 12's biggest point is that if they can separate those media rights, that is huge for UConn. Because obviously basketball is probably, the sport that they can sell themselves on the most. So I think if the Big 12 can capitalize on just capitalizing on that value for UConn, I think it's going to be pretty easy to get them in if they can understand that the football team will get integrated just down the line.
Yeah. And when we're thinking about this expansion for college sports and collegiate athletics and all of that, the Big 12 just expanded to 16 teams. So we're having to take it a step further. And if we add UConn, that ends up being to 17 teams. Are there any other schools that you can think of or that you would like to see in the Big 12 to make us get to 18 or even 20?
I think the thing that is hard is that there might be some teams in basketball that you want to add, but like Gonzaga, there's been rumblings for that for a couple years, but obviously nothing concrete. But it's like they don't have a football team, or so in football you'll still have 17, but obviously basketball you'll have 18. And obviously if you want to poach maybe some of the Pac-2 teams, if you want to bring them on, because you already brought in Colorado, the Arizona schools in Utah. But obviously I'm not sure how much basketball that they would bring. Obviously football, I think just teams in general bring names.
Yep.
But yeah, I think those are the only two teams I can see being from like a major conference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And Gonzaga was one that I would mention. I would love to see Gonzaga in the Big 12, but as you mentioned, no football, so it's kind of hard to get them in there. Another one that's basketball only that I'm really interested in seeing would be a Creighton. I think Creighton, basketball-wise, a great school, great program, has really good history, especially as of late. Greg McDermott has been doing wonders with them. But just from a location perspective, they're up in Omaha, Nebraska, so it's just north of Kansas schools, really kind of is already there. That was another one that I would be really interested to see. Has great fan attendance, plays in a huge arena. I think it would fit nicely, but again, they don't have football. Another thing I was thinking of, though, is what if we could go poach some of those ACC schools? Because I'm not so sure how long that conference is going to be staying afloat, especially with the Florida State and Clemson saga that we're seeing with them against the ACC. I'm wondering if maybe we can go over there to North Carolina and poach some Duke Blue Devils.
I mean, in basketball, having UNC and Duke would be huge. And I mean, UNC is a decent football team too. The past 5 or 6 years they've been a 8 and more win team. But honestly, there were some rumors about Florida State and Clemson that maybe the SEC doesn't want them, especially if things get messy with the ACC. I think they could be two huge teams that the Big 12 could poach. Obviously, I think both of those teams are much heavier in football than they are in basketball, but Clemson usually can at least compete with teams. And obviously, Florida State has had some pretty big recruits in past years. I think with those two programs in terms of basketball, it's very up and down. But I think in terms of football, I think they're must-gets. If the option is there, I think the Big 12 got to move on them too. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think they've both had pretty recent success in basketball. As you mentioned, I think Clemson was the Elite Eight last year. Florida State had the likes of Scotty Barnes, so getting great recruits and had some success in the tournament. But I agree, if they're available in football, you got to go get them. And I already know the Clemson fans seem to love the Big 12 fans a little bit. There's been some love on Twitter as well. So we'll have to make sure and keep up with that. And we'll keep up with realignment as it's ever evolving. But the last thing I want to say on this one is, hey, I'm all for UConn in the Big 12. Already got the jersey ready to go. So UConn, whenever you join, I'll be happily welcoming you into the Big 12 with open arms. Just don't hurt my Oklahoma State Cowboys, please.
Well, let's not even talk about their basketball right now.
Hey, we're the history of the Big 12. That's what I like to say, or at least think. Well, jumping into the next segment, we're going to talk through some of the multi-team events and tournaments that we have upcoming in college basketball. So if you don't know college basketball, some of the famous things they're for, not only for March Madness, but also for these multi-team events or big tournaments that happen near the beginning of the season. And we see a lot happen in the first month of the season, usually near the end of November, which is when all of these are happening. So right around that Thanksgiving time frame. But the first one we want to talk through is about the Maui Invitational. So the schedule just got released last week, and we're going to talk through the teams, break it all down, and discuss maybe who we think is going to win and what teams and players we like in this one. So the rosters and the different teams that we have in the Maui Invitational, we have Memphis, UConn, Colorado, Michigan State, Auburn, Iowa State, Dayton, North Carolina. Connor, what's your initial thoughts on the group of teams that we have that's going to be here in Maui this year?
Yeah, I think this between the Maui and Battle for Atlantis, I think this is the tournament that has kind of held up the best this year. I think you've got projected 4 top 15 teams competing in this, and then you also obviously Dayton has been in the tournament a lot in the past 15 years. You got Michigan State, who they always just seem to pull rabbits out of their hat. You know,
Tom Izzo.
like they're a 10 seed, but then they make the final 4. You know, but then they're a 2 seed and they'll lose in the first round. You know, they're obviously a hit and miss team, but they're a team that can compete. Colorado played really well last year. Obviously, I think they lost a lot of key players. So just about if whoever they retooled with can compete, you know, I think they'll be good. Memphis, you know, I think that's another team that has been up and down past years. They've had some huge names there, but yeah, obviously they're headlined by UConn, reigning 2-time national champions. I'm excited. You know, I think you got some heavyweights in this tournament.
For sure. And I think this is going to be the first, really big test that we see for a lot of these schools. But yeah, as you mentioned, 4 of the projected top 15 in this one from ESPN's way too early rankings that they come out with. But then for the other 4 teams, as you mentioned, Memphis, Penny Hardaway, great coach, has a great history in that program. Colorado made it to the NCAA tournament last year, 3 NBA draft picks. Michigan State with Tom Izzo, can never count them out. Doesn't matter what that roster is going to look like. He's going to have them right, and he's going to have them all the way in the NCAA tournament. And then Dayton, was projected number 1 seed a few years ago. Just a great history there as well, especially as of recent. But really want to see who you're liking in this tournament. Maybe we can talk through the matchups, figure out who we're thinking is going to advance. So for the first one, we got Memphis versus UConn. That's going to be the first game of the Maui Invitational. I think I know where your head's out, but talk me through it.
Yeah, honestly, there's a lot of people excited for this game. Like you said, you got Penny Hardaway and you got Dan Hurley in this matchup. Two prolific head coaches. But, I think you just got to give it to UConn. I just think, from top down, I think they're the better roster. I think Dan Hurley has proven that he is one of the best coaches, if not the best, in college basketball. So, I think you got to give it to UConn.
Yeah, I agree. Although Penny Hardaway was a great coach, great coach and a great player, don't think he stacks up to Dan Hurley. There's a reason the Los Angeles Lakers were going after Dan Hurley this past offseason, trying to get him away from UConn. But I'm excited to see Dan Hurley in Maui. That New Yorker, hopefully he's showing up in a UConn Hawaiian shirt, maybe a little Huskies all over it. I'm just excited to see him vibing in it. But agree, UConn's going to win this one. Even though they don't necessarily return a lot of production, I believe their entire starting 5 is going to be completely new, except for Alex Caraban, who decided to return after going to the Combine. But we do have a lot of new pieces and some that are just going to be playing a bigger role in this UConn offense. I think Dan Hurley's going to have them right. So Hassan Diarra and Samson Johnson, they're probably going to be starting now, basically coming off the bench, but being huge parts of that national championship last year. Then you got Alex Caraban, as I mentioned, just a double-digit scorer for the past 2 seasons, and He's going to be ready to go. And then you got the Liam McNeely, the top 10 incoming high school freshman from Montverde Academy, who actually played with Cooper Flagg that we mentioned earlier. And then lastly, the one of the most heralded transfers, Aiden Mahaney from St. Mary's. Maybe had a little bit of a sophomore dip last year, but really excited to see what he's going to do in this UConn offense. Just don't think the Memphis Tigers can have the firepower to go up against them. So I definitely think UConn's got this one in the bag. Next one, we got the Colorado Buffalo versus the Michigan State Spartan. This is the only one that doesn't feature any of those teams that are necessarily ranked. So you have any initial thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we said it in the intro. I think Michigan State is always going to be able to compete, and I feel like historically they have played well in these kinds of tournaments. So honestly, I'm expecting Michigan State to come out on top. Um, yeah, I think for Colorado, in my opinion, can change. Colorado just lost so much talent this year. Like you said, three to the draft, that were such key pieces. I think like I said, it's going to depend how their roster responds to losing those guys.
I agree. I think Colorado's loss of the three guys to the NBA draft is just going to be a little too much to overcome with this one. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't matter who's on the Michigan State roster. Tom Izzo is going to have him right. Tom Izzo is going to have him ready to play. And Tom Izzo likes to play in Maui. So go ahead and give me Michigan State going on to the next round versus UConn. But then we got another matchup, and this might be the best matchup of the first round. We got Auburn versus Iowa State. Two huge defensive-minded coaches, and TJ Alsenberger and Bruce Pearl just going up against each other with a lot of returning production on both sides of things. What's your initial thoughts, and who do you lean here?
Yeah, this one is really hard. I mean, Auburn is supposed to be one of the best teams in the SEC this year, competing with Tennessee for probably that second best team. I think Alabama has that number one spot, but Auburn's supposed to be a really good team again. I think Bruce Pearl, time and time again, has good teams in the SEC. But I will say Iowa State is returning a guard, Lipsy, that is outstanding. I think he averaged 12 points a game last year, but he was also splitting time with their other guard out there. But yeah, I think he is going to be the main guy this year, and I think he's an outstanding player. Um, yeah, I think Iowa State has this. I feel like we've kind of been going with a higher ranked team so far, but it's hard to see Iowa State not coming out of this game.
Yeah, I agree. Iowa State's defense is going to be absolutely crazy again. I feel like that's just the one thing is they've had great defense always, but now the fact that they can score with guards like Taman Lipsey, and then they also have Keyshawn Gilbert, Curtis Jones, and then
Hmm.
the sharpshooter Milan Momcilovic. Never can say his name right, but just a great shooter. And then they also got another transfer from Charlotte that should be sliding in there to play as well. I think they're going to be a great team, but I'm actually going to lean Auburn on this one. Give me Janiah Broome and Bruce Pearl. Janiah Broome, one of the best players in college basketball, in my opinion, and I think he's going to have an even better season than this one. And pair that out with the returning Chad Baker Mazzara, a good shooter there. But then you got transfers like J.P. Pegues from Furman. And for those of you that remember when Furman beat Virginia a couple of years ago in the NCAA tournament, J.P. Pegues was the one that hit the three to go up against Virginia at the very end. So excited to see him playing a bigger role on the Auburn Tigers now as he's transferred only. And then you got Miles Kelly from Georgia Tech, a 14-point per game scorer. I think this is going to be a really tight one, but I actually feel like Auburn might come out with the upset. Bruce Pearl is in his vibe when he's in Maui, and I'm just really excited to see this matchup go down.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, I think Bruce Pearl is one of my favorite coach personalities. I mean, I feel like he just always has something to say. He's always expressive. Um, but yeah, I think a key for both of these teams is obviously we know defensively what they're going to bring to the table. But man, both of their offenses last year were just so streaky. One game they would show up, score 80 points a game, and then the next game they might score 45. You
Yep.
know, I think So whichever team can just turn it on, I think who will come out on top.
Yeah. Hey, the Maui Invitational, where it's played, the arena that it's played is a shooter's gym. It is a small gym. Actually, drove past it when I was in Maui this summer, and it is one of those like small, little old, seems like a little high school gym. It's a shooter's gym, just meaning a lot of great depth perception, no fans behind the baskets, different things like that. So I think in terms of streakiness, both teams might be on a hot one here, just with the kind of the venue that they're going to be playing in. But then the last matchup we have of the first round is North Carolina versus Dayton. I'll go ahead and go first on this one. I'm really high on North Carolina this season. Although they do lose Armando Bacot, you got RJ Davis coming back. I mean, 21 points per game last year and poised to even go even higher. Elliot Cadeau, who was a freshman last year, struggled with shooting, but great defender and great with assists. I've been seeing a lot of his workouts on social media, and the jump shot looks great. Expecting him to elevate his game, and that being one of the best backcourts in the nation. And then they got the transfer from Belmont, Cade Tyson, and then Ian Jackson as one of the incoming freshmen. I believe he was number 7 in the ESPN 100. A really excited team here. Think it's going to be another great year for the UNC Tar Heels, and I think RJ Davis is going to have another All-American type season.
Yeah, I think North Carolina is one of those teams that obviously they're a blue blood, and I think people are expecting a lot out of them this season. But I think they're going to be one of those teams that is going to live and die by how their guards play. I think you highlighted Cadeau and R.J. Davis. It's kind of if those dudes aren't scoring, who's stepping up? Obviously, if you watched them last year, Cadeau really was not a scorer. He could not shoot the ball well. I think in that tournament game that they had, he ended up shooting pretty well. But yeah. But obviously, R.J. Davis is a contender for Player of the Year, so definitely think that they will be a good team this year.
Agree. And hey, I'm just telling you, the videos I've seen on Twitter of Cadeau's jump shot, it looks nice. It really looks nice. I think last year he was around 7 to 8 points per game. I expect that to go up quite a bit, maybe double. He might get up to 14 points per game, but primarily an assist guy, a ball handler, just distributing the offense with RJ Davis being able to slide over to the shooting guard. But when RJ Davis wants the ball in his hands and Cadeau can spot up, I expect his numbers to go up and he's going to be able to hit those threes this year.
Yeah, and North Carolina has a really good history of developing their guards as they progress through the program. Guys like Joel Berry, Marcus Page. I'm not sure if you remember them from the mid 2010s, but those were guards who their senior year, were just like outstanding, and each year they got better in the program. So definitely expecting that from Cadeau.
You asked me if I remember who Marcus Page is, the double pump 3 to tie the game over Villanova. Come on now. I mean, it led to the most iconic, moment in NCAA tournament history, at least one of them, with Chris Jenkins going down and hitting the buzzer beater to win the national championship. But Marcus Page was a dude.
Crazy threes in that game.
He hit some.
I'm not sure. Obviously, we remember that Chris Jenkins 3 the best, but Marcus Page hit 2 or 3 threes over like 2 or 3 defenders. Obviously, you mentioned that double pump where I don't know how he got that shot off, but he hit some crazy
no one
threes
does
in that game.
Roy Williams didn't know how he got that shot off. Roy Williams didn't know how it went in. That was a more impressive shot than Chris Jenkins' shot. The reason we remember Chris Jenkins' shot is because Chris Jenkins' shot won them the title. But yeah, no, 100% agree. Great at developing guards. I'm really high on them. I think they're going to do great this season. But we'll quickly go through the rest of them real quick. Just want to see if we can predict maybe who we think is going to win the Maui Invitational. So for that next semifinal game, it would be UConn versus Michigan State. On my side, I think it's UConn again. I like Tom Izzo, but I think Dan Hurley is going to have these guys ready to play, and I think they want it. There's going to be a lot of doubt this year. Oh, they can't do it 3 times in a row. They did it twice, and we doubted them then. We're going to doubt them again. And because they don't have these big names, I think a lot of people are going to doubt UConn, but I think there's going to be a lot of guys who step up on this UConn team. Not only Diarra and Johnson, and then McNeely and Caravan and all the rest of them. But I think there's another guy that's going to be coming off the bench. Solomon Ball only played a few minutes this past season just because of how deep they were. I think he's going to be a big factor, not only in this tournament, but this season. I just see UConn advancing past Michigan State this one to make it to the finals of the Maui Invitational.
Yeah, I mean, people can doubt all they want, but UConn's first championship, 2 years ago, I don't think anyone really knew who they were until they got to that Sweet 16 game, and they're like, oh, who is this team? So obviously their players, people knew them that next year. But yeah, just, I think people tend to be like, oh, I don't know someone on their team, so that means they're not good. But I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah, I mean, even last year we had guys like Cam Spencer being, a transfer over from Rutgers. Nobody really knew who Cam Spencer was. He wasn't the huge heralded, transfer like some of the other guys, and he comes in and just balls out and is one of their best players, and now he's on an NBA roster. I just
Hmm.
feel like we're gonna see that same thing. Dan Hurley knows how to, produce talent, and he knows how to coach it as well, and I just can't see them getting past, or I can't see Michigan State getting past them in this one. And then for the last one, I know you would have North Carolina versus Iowa State. I would have North Carolina versus Auburn. But who you think is going to be moving on to that finals matchup against UConn?
I gotta go RJ Davis on this one, in North Carolina. Obviously, I think this is gonna depend on if he's in a slump, it's gonna be hard for North Carolina to win. But if RJ Davis is playing like RJ Davis, I think he'll carry this team to the championship game.
Yep. For me, I actually think it's all matchup dependent. So I know I chose Auburn to move over to the next one. So if they're playing Auburn, I think UNC wins it. Truly, I think UNC moves on. They're playing UConn in the Maui Invitational final. But I actually think if your pick Iowa State moves on to go up against North Carolina, I think it's going to be really early in the season. That Iowa State defense is going to get up on Cadeau and RJ Davis. And as you mentioned, they're going to live and die by their guards and at UNC. I could see Iowa State actually upsetting UNC and making it to the final as well. So just kind of always matchup dependent. So I guess since I picked Auburn, I'm going to go ahead and pick North Carolina to that championship game. But I'm excited to see either one of those games. I think it'd be a great matchup. And then for the last one, we got UConn versus North Carolina. Who you got taking home the trophy in Maui?
I'm taking UNC, man. I think they got that veteran leadership. I know we talked about, UConn has some good players that they'll have. Um, I think oftentimes in tournaments, it's not necessarily, whose team is better, but who has that leadership or who has the singular best player. And so for that reason, I'm going with North Carolina.
Yeah, no, I can see it. I think UNC is a good pick, but I'm just going to do it one more time. Give me UConn. I think they're going to pull it out. I'm a believer in Dan Hurley, maybe too much to a fault, but I'm just going to pick UConn until he proves me otherwise. I mean, he's the best
Fair point.
coaching. He's the best coach in college basketball for the reason we didn't believe in him in the first championship season. Last year, people doubted him. Luckily, I chose them to win the national championship, and they did. But again, just gonna keep believing until I can't anymore. So that's kind of what the Maui Invitational looks like. But moving on to the Battle for Atlantis, another one of those premier multi-team events and tournaments in the college basketball season. We have some pretty big heavyweights in this one as well. And I feel like for this one, what outlines this one the best is a lot of movement in the transfer portal and head coaches in this one. We got teams like Indiana going up against Louisville, Gonzaga going up against West Virginia, Providence versus Oklahoma, and then Arizona going up against Davidson. Any big names or matchups that you want to talk about first for this one?
Yeah, I think first I do want to mention Creighton was originally supposed to be in this tournament, but they pulled out to play in the Players Tournament. But with that being said, I think there's probably one matchup here that we're kind of like not any big names, and that's going to be OU versus Providence. Um, yeah, I think OU lost a couple of their key guys to the transfer portal. they're moving to the SEC. You know, they're going from one superpower conference to the other superpower conference. I think they're, not really a high profile matchup, but um, honestly, the one I'm probably most excited for is Gonzaga versus West Virginia. Um, which West Virginia is not projected to be that good of a team, especially last year after. Were they the worst team in the Big 12 last year, or they were definitely one of the worst teams in the Big 12 last year? But they have a new coach, um, and he's bringing his son with him. Remind me his name again. I'm blanking on his name.
Yeah, so
Um,
a new coach, Doug DeVries, he's coming over from
yes,
Drake, and
there we
then
go.
bringing his son Tucker from Drake as well. Which Tucker, just real quick background, Tucker actually decided to go to Drake to play for his father. He had a bunch of power at the time, Power Five, now Power Four, offers to play elsewhere, but decided that he would much rather get coached by his dad at Drake and go to a smaller school rather than going to a big school. And we've seen Drake had huge success with those two there. I believe they've been in the tournament the past couple of seasons, making some noise, and Tucker's been a prolific scorer at Drake. He's like a 6'7" small forward, averaging north of 15 points per game. I think he's going to make an immediate impact at West Virginia, and Doug is a great coach as well. So they're West Virginia, and also known as Press Virginia. I think this is a great coach to follow Bob Huggins there.
Yeah, for sure. And then obviously they're going to play Gonzaga, who has yet, I know they probably want to consider themselves blue bloods of college basketball just because they've had so many, 28 plus win seasons the past 10 years, you know. Um, Obviously not been able to solidify themselves yet just because they lack the championships there. Um, yeah, I definitely think with the addition of that coach and Tucker, West Virginia definitely could compete. But another matchup that I think is really intriguing is the Louisville Indiana one. Obviously, we know historically Indiana is probably one of the best basketball teams. But they haven't won a championship since the 80s. And then Louisville obviously had to vacate their championship back in 2012, 2013. Can't remember exactly what year it was. But I think these are two teams that would consider themselves blue bloods, whereas other people might not consider them that. I think those two teams have a lot to prove this season.
For sure. And this is an exciting matchup, too, because we got a lot of new faces on both sides of this. So for Louisville, not only in the player department, but we also have a new coach in Pat Kelsey coming over from Charleston, which he's seen massive success there. And a really great hire for Louisville, in my opinion, was wanting Oklahoma State to go after him, but he obviously getting the Louisville job means we didn't even have a chance being one of the biggest names in college basketball. They've been struggling for the past couple of seasons, but bring in Pat Kelsey and he's gotten a lot of transfers. Got Traore from BYU, brought some guys from Charleston and a couple of guys elsewhere. So really going to see them take the step up. And then Indiana, Mike Woodson used to be a coach in the NBA, coaches in Indiana now, and been on the hot seat for the past couple of years, it feels like, but we haven't seen any movement there. But as you mentioned, Indiana, I would say they're one of the blue bloods, but haven't seen any recent success. But they have absolutely dominated this transfer portal. I mean, bringing in guys like Miles Rice from Washington State, who was a breakout star last year, 15 points per game. Kanan Carlisle from Stanford, knockdown shooter, 11.5 points per game. And then Umar Ballo, who started his career at Gonzaga, moved down to Arizona with Tommy Lloyd as he moved over there, and then now transfers over to Indiana. Just a stacked team in terms of transfers. And then they already had guys like Malik Renew and Mackenzie Mbako. This, for context, this Indiana team is going to be ginormous in terms of height from their starting lineup. I believe Miles Rice and Kanan Carlisle are both a little bit on the taller side for guards, but then Mbako, Renew, and Ballo are all like 6'8" and above. They're going to be huge. My only concern for Indiana is what the shooting is going to look like, but I think Indiana is actually poised for a great season. We'll see how Mike Woodson has those guys playing. But I think this is going to be a great matchup, just seeing the new look Louisville and then also the transfers for Indiana. But if I had to pick this matchup, I would lean Indiana just with all the star power that they've accumulated this offseason.
Yeah, I'm definitely leaning towards Indiana. I think obviously you just went through the rosters. Indiana just from top down has the better roster between the transfers, some of their recruits, they've had in the past couple of years. I think the big thing for Indiana though is can their roster play well together? And I think that's a question that a lot of teams, are going to have to find out and ask themselves is obviously transfer portal was huge this year. I mean, every team we've talked about, there's at least two transfers that, we've mentioned. And I think obviously for Indiana, if they're wanting to get back up, and to be one of the elites of college basketball, they're going to have to find a way to make these guys fit.
100%. And then I really want to quickly jump back to Gonzaga because I like Gonzaga and I'm really excited to see what this team does this year. Honestly, didn't have a lot of people that they lost. The only person that they lost that contributed was Anton Watson, and he's now trying to make his way in the NBA. But still got the backcourt of Ryan Nimhard, Nolan Hickman. Think they're going to be one of the best backcourts in the nation, just continuing to grow and play with each other. And then Ben Gregg and Graham Ike coming in at the forward and center spot. And then they got the transfer of Michael Ajayi from Pepperdine, as well as having Dusty Stromer off the bench. Steele Venters is coming back from injury. Gonzaga is going to be at one of the deepest teams in college basketball this year. And I think we're going to see this in the battle for Atlantis. I'm expecting Gonzaga actually to win this one. And I think this could be a year that Gonzaga could finally hang the net and put that championship and bring it back to Spokane.
I mean, it's definitely always a possibility, especially in college basketball. When it hits March, we've seen anything can happen. Um, yeah, Gonzaga's just always one of those teams the past 10 years that it just seems they keep guys around for 3 to 4 years, and it seems like every time they have a graduating class, it's like, oh, okay, they're probably done, but it's like they just reload. And
Mm-hmm.
you're just like, where did they pull these guys from? Because it's not like, obviously, they've had some top recruits, but it's not like every player they have is like, oh, this dude was the best in high school. Like they're one of those programs that recruits, but they also do an exceptional job at developing their players.
They do, and keeping them. I mean, when we
Hmm.
see people leave, the
Yes.
only two like huge players that we've seen leave Gonzaga recently has been Umar Ballo, which he was playing behind Drew Timme, so that makes sense. You're not going to play Umar Ballo over Drew Timme, even though he's a great player. And then Hunter Salas, and he was playing kind of behind Nolan Hickman, so he wasn't get to play at all. And then the other guys that are leaving are your Jalen Suggs, Corey Kispert, Chet Holmgren, Drew Timme. They're playing, and the only time they're leaving is they're either graduating or they've played themselves into getting picked in the NBA draft. So as you mentioned, these guys are playing a long time at Gonzaga, developing under the system, developing under Mark Few, and it's paying dividends. And I think this year could really pay back Gonzaga, and they could make a big run for it. And then the last game we have in this one is Arizona versus Davidson. Davidson, I feel like everybody just knows Davidson because of Steph Curry, but Bob McKillop is a great coach for the Davidson Wildcats, and I wouldn't count them out against anybody. They've had some other big names recently, like Kellen Grady, but Arizona, ranked number 9 coming into this season from ESPN. They had a great run last year, fell a little short of what some people projected, but still have big returners like Caleb Love, Jaden Bradley, who played amazing in the NCAA tournament. KJ Lewis played great in the NCAA tournament as well. And then one of the big names that a lot of people will be excited about is Trey Townsend from Oakland. He was on that Cinderella team, and everyone knows Jack Golke, the guy that was just shooting all the threes. But the dude that was, getting bodies in the paint and doing all the dirty stuff and scoring a ton of points as well, Trey Townsend actually transfers over to Arizona to play for Tommy Lloyd. This team is reloaded, and I think this team's going to be stacked and poised for a great season as well.
Yeah, I mean, you have a Player of the Year contender, I think, in Caleb Love. Obviously, started his career out at UNC, didn't like it. Transferred to Arizona. Phenomenal player. I think he'll obviously be solid for them. But yeah, I think you hit it. Trey Townsend was a huge pickup for them. I think he just gives them obviously another scorer, another quality player. Honestly, this was kind of my pick to win this tournament. I really like Arizona. They're just kind of one of those teams that are kind of consistently in the top 10. They kind of have yet to make a championship game, but I really like this team.
Yeah, I 100% agree. This was actually who I was thinking was going to be the championship game was going to be Gonzaga versus Arizona in this one. And talk about a great matchup with Mark Few and his previous assistant coach Tommy Lloyd going head to head at the championship game for the battle for Atlantis. And then you got some great players, as you mentioned. So I can see it going both ways on this one. Last thing I'll mention is Arizona, first year in the Big 12. So not only are we going to get to see them play against some teams here, and if Oklahoma wins that first matchup, it's going to be the old Big 12 versus the new Big 12. Go Arizona on that one. But first year in the Big 12, so a lot of new matchups for Arizona, and we'll see how they do through the course of the season there. But I agree. I think Arizona would be my second pick behind Gonzaga to win this one. And then the last tournament we want to talk about is this new tournament that Connor alluded to earlier about Creighton with the Playas Era Festival or tournament. So this is happening the same time as the Battle for Atlantis and the Maui Invitational. But what this tournament is it's on their website, they say it's a week-long celebration of college basketball that's taking place the week of Thanksgiving in Las Vegas, featuring some of the best teams and elites, players, coaches, and different things like that. And for this tournament, what makes this one a lot different is this is where the teams and the players are actually getting NIL money to play in this tournament. So I believe each school is making some amount of money, and that's going towards the NIL for their school for the year. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of these top teams wanting to play in this new tournament and signing deals to play in this tournament for multiple seasons, because they're actually getting something out of it besides just, this tournament that they get to play in. So the teams that we got are Houston, Alabama, Rutgers, Notre Dame, Creighton, Oregon, Texas A&M, San Diego State. 5 of the 8 teams ranked in ESPN's top 25. And then we got teams like Oregon and San Diego State who aren't ranked but who've made a lot of noise in the NCAA tournament recently. This group of teams is just absolutely loaded. And I think for the first time for the Playas Era tournament, they're making some noise. And I'm excited to hear your take on it, Connor.
Yeah, honestly, I'm a little surprised that the Maui and Battle for Atlantis didn't do this already. I know college sports is so like tradition heavy, so I wonder if that kind of played into factor as well, we haven't had to do this in the past, so why would we start doing it now? But I don't know whoever thought of this definitely jumped in on NIL, and the trend of college sports with that. And obviously it's worked out, they got so many heavy schools in here. I mean, can we just talk about this first round matchup? Alabama versus Houston, 2 of the top 4 teams. Arguably, the top teams in their respective conferences. Like, the fact that that's a first-round matchup is just incredible.
Hey, it's a rematch.
I think there's a lot to
a rematch of the Elite Eight last year.
Yeah, especially, now that you got Mark Sears back, that was huge for Alabama. But I think, like you highlighted, there's 3 other top 25 teams in here. And as you said, Oregon and San Diego State have made runs. San Diego State has been a pretty consistently good team the past few years. And then Notre Dame has not been the best. They had a couple good years in the mid 2010s, not as good recently. So I think they're definitely the outlier in this tournament. But with that being said, Notre Dame's a big name in college in general, so yeah, I'm honestly really excited to see how this tournament plays out.
Yeah, I think this tournament's going to be really fun to watch, but they're playing it a little different. So the there's not necessarily like a bracket. They're playing in two different pods, and then I believe the winners of each pod are playing each other in like a championship game. So that first round match, the first matchup of Houston, Alabama, and then Rutgers, Notre Dame. That's one pod, and then we got Creighton, Oregon, Texas A&M, San Diego State as the other pod. But Houston, Alabama is going to be one of, if not the best matchup from this week of MTEs. Number 4 and number 2, according to ESPN, as I mentioned earlier, rematch of the Elite Eight game. Not a whole lot of movement in terms of players leaving. I mean, obviously, Houston lost Jamal Shed to the NBA, but they got Milos Uzan from Oklahoma, which is a good point guard, but they return LJ Cryer, Emmanuel Sharp, Juwan Roberts, Javier Francis. So that starting lineup is going to be stacked with a lot of shooting and a lot of size. And then you also got Alabama, as you mentioned, the biggest name to come back to college basketball, arguably, and Mark Sears. That was one of those things where I felt like if Mark Sears left for the NBA, Alabama was not going to be the same team that they're going to be now with Mark Sears coming back. That's just the type of player he is. And then you also got Grant Nelson returning, and then they got the big man from Rutgers, Clifford Amorie, who I know a lot of teams in the Big 12 specifically were going after. Just a lot of big names here. I think it's going to be a great matchup. Honestly, a really hard game to pick. I'd probably lean Alabama just with Mark Sears, but this one's going to be a tough one. I'm really excited to watch this game.
Yeah, I think you hit it. It's a real tough one. I will say I'm not the biggest Bama fan just in general across sports. I'm sure that's not an uncommon take. But Mark Sears is must-watch basketball. Like whether you hate Bama or not, he is one of the most fun players that you will watch play college basketball this season. Just the speed he plays at and just how skilled he is incredible.
He is, and he reminds me a little bit like Jalen Brunson, but just tailors a little more to shooting rather than driving in, but the small guard with the one arm sleeve, to be honest. But I love the way he plays.
Lefties.
Yeah, and not only is Mark Sears one of the most fun players to watch and must-watch basketball, he's on, unfortunately, I know it's Alabama, but they're one of the most fun teams to watch and must-watch basketball. The way Nate Oates has this team playing, I mean, if you like a barrage of threes and dunks, watch Alabama basketball. They take more than almost anybody in the nation, and it's just really fun to watch. And then that contrasted with Houston just being the complete opposite. We don't care if we beat you 42-41, like we are going to play defense all the way and all the time. Just a great matchup to watch. And then that next matchup in the pod, we got Rutgers versus Notre Dame. And the only reason why I want to highlight this one is for Rutgers specifically. So Rutgers, you wouldn't really think anything of it. They made a little noise recently with Ron Harper Jr. Actually playing well and getting them into the tournament a couple of years ago and then making it to the NBA draft. But Rutgers has actually got 2 top 4 recruits in the ESPN 100 and incoming freshmen with Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey. So basically, number 2 and number 4, Ace Bailey being just behind Cooper Flagg in the rankings, and then Dylan Harper, I believe, is the best point guard in the rankings. Really just coming over to Rutgers, trying to revive that New Jersey, New York basketball style. And I think that's going to be a fun duo to watch this upcoming season. ESPN has them ranked as number 25 right now, and I think that's more so just with the names that they have right there. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see Rutgers making some noise come March.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the perfect opportunity for Rutgers to let, the rest of the country know, like, hey, like, we're not just a pushover team, like, we're here to compete. Like you said, they got 2 of the top 4 players, according to the ESPN 100. But, they also have some pretty good players on the roster through the transfers or returning players. I know Jeremiah Williams, scored 12 points a game. Pretty good player, But yeah, I definitely think this is a key tournament for them to see if they can compete or not at the top level.
Agreed. Want to hear your take on the Creighton versus Oregon game because Creighton has a really interesting team. So wanted to see your thoughts on what they're going to look like this upcoming season.
Yeah, obviously I think we discussed Oregon was actually one of ESPN's like borderline top 25 teams, I think. So Oregon's not, a pushover. But I will say Creighton does have a lot of huge names. Obviously, they're returning their center, is it Kalkbrenner?
Yep.
You know, 17 points per game scorer. And up until that, honestly, I think even that game they lost, like he played so well in the tournament. Um, but obviously, I think there's a pretty big transfer that we have to bring up. That's Pop Isaacs from Texas Tech. 16 points per game scorer. He can dish the rock when he needs to. I feel like he just runs all over the court, and it's so hard to follow him just because of how fast he is. Um, and obviously, you got Stephen Ashworth, returning 11 points per game scorer. I think this team, as per usual, is going to score a lot of points. Um, and then, yeah, I think they're a decently solid defensive team. So I'm excited for this team this year.
Yeah, I like what Greg McDermott's going on in Creighton. Kalkbrenner being one of the best centers in the nation, and then another player I want to mention is Mason Miller. So he's actually the son of NBA legend and sharpshooter Mike Miller. So last year struggled a little bit in his freshman season, only averaged 5.5 points per game, but he is a great shooter, and I expect to see that sophomore jump this year. So I can definitely see where Creighton's going to make a lot of noise. And then agree, as you mentioned, Oregon was a fringe team, but they played really well last year at the end of the season. And Fale Dante, though, is gone, their big man in the post, and he balled out in the NCAA tournament. But a lot of other names on that roster that I can think make some noise. But the last matchup we have in this one that we'll quickly touch on is Texas A&M versus San Diego State. Texas A&M ranked 12th by ESPN in their, again, way too early rankings. And then we got San Diego State, who's not necessarily ranked, but has made a lot of noise and made it all the way to the national title game 2 years ago. But does anybody stand out for you on this A&M team? I know there's a couple of guys I want to make sure and mention.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the biggest name is going to be Wade Taylor the fourth. This is his third year in this system. We obviously know the prolific scorer he is. Yeah, I think another big player that they returned is Henry Coleman the third. 8.8 points per game. Obviously not their go-to scorer, but he's a big contributor to this team. It was huge that they retained him. Yeah, and then obviously they got Phelps from SMU. Almost 15 points per game is, I think, what he scored there. So they brought in another scorer. I really like this team. I think they're always just a tough team when they compete. And honestly, I think they're a dark horse to potentially win this tournament if they play well enough. But honestly, they're a team that very much they'll win and die by Wade Taylor the fourth. It definitely depends how he plays.
100%, yeah. Wade Taylor's either going to give you buckets and drop 30 plus, or he's going to go 3 for 18 and, finish with 10. So that's kind of where we end up in that 20 point per game. Just kind of the up and down season, but excited to see him in his third year at A&M and agree. Henry Coleman, although he's not the biggest scorer, I think his production on the offensive end will jump a little bit, but this dude can defend and this dude gets rebounds. And that's exactly what you need when you have a player like Wade Taylor shooting the rock. But last question I'll have on this one for you is, who do you think is going to win this one, or who do you think is going to show the most in the first ever Players Era Festival in Las Vegas?
I think I am going to have to give it to Houston in this one. I know we talked about their defense, and you said, like, they don't care if they outscore you by 1 point, like they're going to be in your face defense. But with that being said, they do have some scorers on that team. I think we all know LJ Cryer from his time at Baylor and last year. That dude wants to pull the three any chance he gets, and he can get hot and he just won't miss. But obviously, I think there's a couple other players who can also contribute. Whereas I think obviously, Alabama is not known for the defense. They like to score. That's pretty much all they want to do. They'll outscore you 100 to 97, and just because of that, I think Houston has the ability to play defense and offense at times. I think that's what gives them the edge.
Yep, I like it. I agree. Houston or Alabama, basically whoever comes out of that game, I assume will be the winner for this one. But you hit it right on the head. You got Houston's defense, but they can also score, and sharpshooter LJ Cryer and Emmanuel Sharp. But then Alabama is, we're just gonna keep scoring, and you just gotta try and stop us, and hopefully you can type thing. So yeah, whoever wins that one, I'm gonna take Alabama because I got Alabama in that game. But again, if Houston wins, I can see them winning it as well. So those are the big MTEs that we have for this season in college basketball. There's a lot of others with a lot of smaller schools, or we got things like the Champions Classics, which are just 2 games, not necessarily a tournament style. But there are a few other teams that we want to talk about in today's podcast that we want to just to highlight and preview before this upcoming season of college basketball. And the first one's got to be one that we've already mentioned. But I feel like you can't talk college basketball without touching this school, the Duke Blue Devils and Cooper Flag. Connor, what's your initial thoughts on the Duke Blue Devils? You think they're going to exceed expectations, or what do you think their ceiling is?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you're headlined by Cooper Flag, but they also have a few other 4 and 5 stars that they've brought in. This was one of the best classes, I think we've seen. Um, but honestly, I think their most important player, depending, is Tyrese Proctor. Um, Duke has had some pretty inconsistent point guard play, which isn't to say they haven't had good players. I feel like they just haven't had someone who consistently has been able to control the offense. You saw it from Tyrese Proctor the past 2 seasons, but I'm hoping this third season at Duke he's really able to flourish. He obviously Caleb Foster's there, but Tyrese should be the primary ball handler. I think there were a couple other players on past 2 seasons who definitely took away from what Tyrese Proctor can do. But yeah, I'm very excited for this team. I think they have the potential to go really deep during March. But I think it's going to depend on Tyrese Proctor and how their shooting goes, because Duke has really struggled at times from three in the past few seasons.
Yeah, I agree, and 100%. Tyrese Proctor, this is going to be his third year in the program, and a lot of people were expecting that sophomore jump last year that we see with him jumping up. And actually, some people were predicting an All-American type season, and he didn't have that. I feel like that was because of Jeremy Roach, who was in the program, and he was kind of the main ball handler, and Tyrese Proctor had to play more of that shooting guard role at times. But now with Jeremy Roach gone to Baylor, I can see Tyrese Proctor stepping into it. And then when you have a guy like Cooper Flag to play alongside, I think it's gonna open a lot more things up and make a lot of things easier. I'm excited to see them doing some pick and rolls and maybe some lobs that we see to Cooper Flag. But then, as you mentioned, a lot of other 4 and 5 star prospects. We got Kaman Maluch, a 5 star center that we're expecting to start as well, and then big transfers that kind of help bolster from a veteran perspective. We got Malik Brown from Syracuse, and then also Mason Gillis from Purdue. If you remember, he played a lot alongside of Zach Edey the past couple of seasons. He's a knockdown shooter from the corner and can grab boards as well. So I think what John Shire has at these Duke Blue Devils, I think he's really excited about, and I'm excited to see as well. Obviously, Cooper Flag being must-watch TV. For this team specifically, I'm a little nervous, though, about their youth, especially with how college basketball and the transfer portal has happened over the past couple of years in NIL with teams getting a lot older. We see teams like Duke just struggling at end of games in terms of not having that veteran presence. The transfers should help, but the loss of Jeremy Roach, I think, is definitely going to hurt going down the stretch. But when you have Cooper Flag, that's just one of those, almost once in a lifetime generational talents, it feels like, with the way that people have been talking about him. So I could see them making it a long ways as well, but we'll see how that impacts. But do think that Tyrese Proctor's can have a step up year.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, obviously a lot of youth, which is a common theme with Duke ever since the one and done era. But I think something is like, obviously Kentucky has been doing this also since then, and a few other schools, but I think that's been proven that's not a championship winner right there. Obviously Duke won a championship in 2015, headlined by Jahlil Okafor, Tyus Jones, and Justice Winslow. But if you ever look on every championship team, they have juniors and seniors that are the leadership on that team. Obviously, Jahlil Okafor was their go-to scorer, but Quinn Cook on that Duke team was their leadership. Averaged like 13, 14 a game when the game's on the line, they put the ball in his hands a lot. Um, yeah, obviously, I think Tyrese can be that guy for this team. I just think it's a matter of fact if he takes that step or not.
For sure. That's a great point as well because, again, with the transfer portal now, every team's getting older. You need that veteran leadership. You need those guys that have been there. And we see that with Malik Brown. We see Mason Gillis, who has played in a national championship game. Um, but are they going to be those type of guys that are able to, actually be the ones that grab the ball and do something? We usually see that from the guard side of things where that's going to fall into Tyrese Proctor's hands. So we'll see kind of what step he makes this next season. But another team that we wanted to talk about, and I feel like has been a huge hot topic this year, is the Arkansas Razorbacks, and that's with the addition of John Calipari as the new head coach at Arkansas. Also surrounded by just a star-studded crew in terms of transfer portal additions. Was the number one ranked transfer class in college basketball this season. Basically, when John Calipari came to Arkansas, they had nobody on the roster. Literally, he came and someone asked him about the roster, and he was like, "What roster? We literally have nobody." Yeah, they had like one guy. But obviously, went to work in the transfer portal and also on the getting some new freshmen to come and commit over Kentucky as well. So excited to see this team. But who do you like and who stands out for you for this Arkansas Razorback group?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest transfers that he got ended up being DJ Wagner. Following him from Kentucky, I think that's big. Obviously, he knows Calipari's system. He knows what is expected of him. Definitely someone who could be, emerge as a leader on this team. But they also have Janelle Davis from Florida Atlantic, 18 points a game. Played really well. If you watch college basketball, you've probably heard his name a couple times. Obviously, prolific scorer, 18 points a game is really good in college. Um, yeah, I think it's obviously Calipari quite literally had to build this team from nothing. Um, like you said, there was absolutely no one on the roster except maybe one player. They all left. Um, but yeah, I think they're going to be one of the interesting teams just because usually coaches, it takes them 1 or 2 seasons to get who they want, whereas Calipari spent the whole offseason building the team that he wants.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's kind of a nice thing about building the team that you want. Obviously, you didn't have a whole lot of people to choose from, but you are John Calipari. You are arguably one of the greatest recruiters in college basketball history. So really just picking the pieces that you like to get. As you mentioned, DJ Wagner coming back from Kentucky. A lot of people thought he was going to be a one and done coming into college, but didn't see quite the production that we were all expecting. Only averaged 10 points per game last year, but think he's going to take that next step as a sophomore. And honestly, he might be an All-American. We also, as you mentioned, Jonell Davis played in a Final Four for Florida Atlantic and Dusty May 2 years ago. Such a prolific scorer. We got Carter Knox, the freshman, top 26 prospect, decommitting from Kentucky and following John Calipari to Arkansas. And then Trevon Brazil. A lot of you might have heard his name 2 years ago. He was injured last year, but a huge athlete. I think John Calipari can do a lot with this guy. Also can knock down the corner three. And then he also brought over Big Z. If you remember him, the 7-foot international player. He brought him over from Kentucky as well. So excited to see him there. But this team is just a bunch of random dudes that got thrown together. But it's John Calipari. I think he's going to have them right. Excited to see what he does with them this season. All right, next one that I wanted to discuss, I kind of want to jump a little bit, is we just talked about John Calipari leaving Kentucky, going to Arkansas. But now let's go look what Kentucky's looking like this year. So Kentucky got a new head coach, Mark Pope, who was the previous coach of BYU, and this whole coaching carousel that was going on. And Mark Pope actually previously played at Kentucky, won a national championship with the Kentucky Wildcats, and he's had a lot to do and a lot to say when he's got to Kentucky. This is his dream job. I know he liked it at BYU, but obviously nothing's going to match being at your alma mater. And he got to work early, bringing in Kerr Kriisa from West Virginia, who previously played at Arizona for Tommy Lloyd. Also brought in Jackson Robinson from BYU, Andrew Carr from Wake Forest. This team is a bunch of transfers, just like John Calipari has Arkansas. But I'm curious, Connor, looking at these two rosters, who do you think is going to have the better season, Arkansas or Kentucky?
I think that's a great question. I think it'll probably be very close between these two teams. Um, the Kentucky just interests me just because obviously there are a bunch of transfers, but they have a lot of pretty good scores coming from that transfer portal. Um, Also, I'm not sure if you noticed, but three of their projected starters are former Big 12 players, coming from West Virginia, Oklahoma, and BYU. But then Andrew Carr and Amar Williams, are no slouches. They're both 12 points per game and 13.5 points per game scorers. Um, Once again, I think it's this era of college basketball where obviously you can bring in as many players as you want, but will the transfers all fit together?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think they got a plethora of different options for Kentucky, but I think the one that I want to highlight the most is Jackson Robinson. This guy averaged 14.2 points per game last year from BYU. He was an absolute stud. He actually came off the bench, he didn't even start. And Coach Mark Pope wanted him to start. But Jackson Robinson knew that he was better used and utilized off the bench. So he was willing to come off the bench to let his teammates start it out, and then he would obviously come in and close. To have that type of guy on your team, bringing him over to Kentucky is really fun to see. I'm excited for the nation to see Jackson Robinson. I think he's going to have a great season. Could be an All-American type guy. Might be looking to go to the NBA draft next year after the type of season he has, but we'll continue to look at that. I think for me personally, I would lean Arkansas. Just think they have a little more star power. And
Sure.
Calipari is just a little more proven than Mark Pope. Although we know Mark Pope is a great coach, Calipari's been doing this for a while. Won a championship at Kentucky. Obviously, had Derrick Rose on Memphis and coach well there. So we've seen him do it with multiple different teams. And Arkansas's combination of NIL and just the funding they have behind that program is absolutely insane. Rumored to be the biggest in all of college basketball. I think I just had to put my hand behind John Calipari on this one.
Yeah, obviously BYU was good last year. I think Mark Pope probably still needs to solidify himself as one of the better coaches at the college level. I know you talked about Jackson Robinson, but honestly, I'm really interested to see who kind of emerges as that second player for Kentucky. Because honestly, I think the other four projected starters are pretty even in terms of production. So I'm just kind of interested to see who Mark Pope ends up being like, you're my second guy.
Yeah. It could be a plethora of different guys. Might be one of the bigger guys. Because I doubt it's Kirk Kriisa. He's gonna have the ball in his hands, but Kirk Kriisa is more known for the assists, facilitating the offense, different things like that. We saw that at both Arizona and West Virginia. So might see it from some of the forwards. But I just think Jackson Robinson's an absolute stud. So it doesn't really matter who you got in the second option when you got Jackson Robinson. Great shooter, but I'm definitely interested to see that as well, and who will emerge as that duo partner to Jackson Robinson. Now jumping over to another SEC school, we got the Tennessee Volunteers. So Tennessee Volunteers lost a lot this past year. Dalton Connect to the NBA, which was a ton of production. We also lose Jonas Adu to, I believe, Baylor. And then we have a couple of other guys that are no longer with the program just from graduating. But we do have a couple of transfers and a couple of guys that stuck around. So we got Zakai Ziegler, dynamic point guard. He's a little bit on the smaller end, but great defender, good facilitator, 12 points per game. And then Jemai Mashak. This dude is just an absolute dog on the defensive end. One of the guys where it's just like you put him on the best player on the other team and you just say, don't let up. But then we got a plethora, a trio of other transfers, Connor. So I was wondering what your opinions on them were and what we see and what we're thinking Tennessee's going to look like.
Yeah, honestly, I know two of their transfers are coming from smaller schools in North Florida and Hofstra. which obviously does not dictate how good a player is, because obviously we've seen some really good players come from those small schools. But I'm just kind of interested to see how they fit in here. Um, yeah, I will say though, I think Rick Barnes is probably gonna have to expect Ziegler to take a big step in terms of scoring, leadership. Obviously, we know what he does on the defensive end, one of the best in the country at defense. Um, yeah, I think Meshack is going to have to develop an offensive game too. Obviously, only 4.5 points a game last year, but I don't think they really needed him to do that. Whereas this year, I would just expect him to take another step. Um, yeah, I think the first probably couple weeks, I think Tennessee's probably going to have to feel out who's the what lineup they want to go with, who's kind of fit in where, you know. But if one thing we do know about Tennessee, they're going to be one of the best defensive teams in the country.
Yeah, that's for sure. Rick Barnes always got them ready to play defense. The one guy I'm really excited to see on Tennessee is Chaz Lanier from North Florida, just shy of 20 points per game last year, and this guy's absolute stud, can fill it up from all over. Great shooter, also is able to get in the paint a little bit and do some work there as well. So I think we're going to see a lot of scoring come from him. He's going to take on probably that Dalton Connect role that we saw last year, but just don't know if he's going to have the same type of motor, the same type of production that we saw from Dalton Connect. Obviously, Dalton Connect being one of the best players in college basketball last season. All right, now jumping over to a couple of different Big 12 schools. Feel like we can't leave them off this list. Jumping over to ESPN's number one in their way too early rankings, the Kansas Jayhawks. We talked a little bit about them in Transition 3 from our last podcast, but can't leave this team off. They are locked and loaded, and Bill Self is going to have this team ready to go. I said it last time, and I'll say it again. I think this is a Final Four or bust year for Bill Self and the Kansas Jayhawks.
Yeah, that's expectation, and honestly, that's what I'm assuming they're gonna do. I mean, they're bringing back their two big men in Hunter Dickinson and KJ Adams Jr. I'm not sure how many people know, but when Hunter Dickinson would foul out or when he was injured, KJ Adams is actually who they had down low. Obviously, not the physical force that Hunter Dickinson is on the defense and offensive end, but he played really well, even though he was undersized there. I'm not sure if you got to watch the games when he was playing center, but he played exceptionally well there. But now the fact that they're bringing Hunter Dickinson back, and so he's kind of sliding into his more natural power forward position, I think they're going to be a dominant force down low with those two guys there. One fouls out, you got the other one. But I think DeJuan Harris also, at the point guard position, I think Kansas, is one of those schools where it just always seems like they have a point guard that can manage their offense, whether scoring or distributing. I'm kind of expecting Harris to be a little more of a distributor this year just because they have some other prolific scorers. But yeah, I think there's a reason ESPN's projecting them to be the number one team, and I think a big part of it has to do with Hunter Dickinson.
Yeah, I agree. Might be the best center in college basketball now that Zach Edey has left. And honestly, last year we saw he's extended his range a little bit, actually being able to pick and pop a little bit and hit it from the top of the key. But KJ Adams is not necessarily the tallest guy in terms of a post player, but this guy jumps out of the gym. He is so athletic. If you ever watch him play going down the middle of the paint, if he catches a lob or just catches it and goes up for the dunk, I mean, he's doing the back scratcher, just physical force, really fun to watch. And I'm big on KJ Adams, love his game. Think he's a 12 and 10 type of guy, just does all the dirty work, and it's kind of everything and everywhere you need him to be. Then we got AJ Storr from Wisconsin. This might be my top transfer this year. 17 points per game last year at Wisconsin. A great wing player for them, and a great scorer. Can shoot it, can drive it, can post you up, can do just about everything. I think he's going to have a great season with the Jayhawks, and also Having Zeke Mayo on the other wing, and in the backcourt with DeJuan Harris. He played for South Dakota State last year and was roughly around 19 points per game. Great shooter. And then, as you mentioned it, you got the facilitator DeJuan Harris running the offense, getting everybody in their spots. Not too bad on the defensive side either when in terms of steals. Just think this team is poised for a great year. And don't forget, we got a bunch of other transfers coming off the bench and ready to go as well. This team, alongside Gonzaga, might be my top two deepest teams in the nation, and they're going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on them just because we've talked about them before in great detail, but I think their biggest X factor is they have Bill Self as their head coach. Won a few championships, definitely one of the greatest coaches of all time in college basketball. I think Kansas will be in a good position come March.
Yeah, I agree. Ultimately, it all comes down to that. When you have Bill Self as your coach, it doesn't really matter who you're throwing out there. You're going to be in a pretty good spot and ready to go. But talk about another Big 12 team with a great coach, Baylor Bears and Scott Drew. And they retooled again. Scott Drew has learned how to use this transfer portal and has been doing it for the past couple of years. He was doing it previously too, but obviously the guys had to sit out a season. But back when they won the title back in 2021 with Jared Butler, Maceo Teague, and Davion Mitchell, fun fact, those were all actually transfers. But now we come back and now we got the new era of the transfer portal where they can transfer and play immediately. And we got Jeremy Roach from Duke and Norchad Omier from Miami, two of the biggest names in the transfer portal. Combine that with Jaden Nunn and Langston Love returning, both double-digit scores for Baylor. And then we got one of the most exciting freshmen, VJ Edgecombe, coming in, and he has been balling out. I don't know if you saw the videos, but he was playing with the Bahamas national team this summer, so playing alongside guys like DeAndre Ayton and Buddy Hield, and he was putting in some work. I am very excited for this Baylor Bear team. I think Scott Drew has a great group and obviously a great coach in Scott Drew. Just wondering your thoughts on what you're seeing from the Baylor side.
Yeah, I think Baylor is a little like Gonzaga, where every time, their star player graduates, people are like, okay, there's no way, they're going to be good again. But then, Scott Drew just pulls something out. Bringing in Jeremy Roach was huge to replace their guards. Obviously they still have Jaden Nunn, but I think Jeremy Roach to be their primary ball handler. I think something similar, we said with Tyrese Proctor. I think Jeremy Roach was kind of held back by being on a star-studded team, with young players and older players. So I also think, Scott Drew can be someone who can help develop his three-point shot more than it already is. Because if you know something about Baylor, they also love to shoot a lot of threes. So I think Jeremy Roach is going to have a field day facilitating as well. But yeah, I think Edgecombe, huge gift for them. I'm expecting big things from him. I think they're expecting big things from him. But yeah, I think Baylor has a good balance of returning starters and transferred and new players, whether through transfers or these freshman class.
Yeah, I feel like Scott Drew has kind of perfected a system in terms of the transfer portal and freshmen, where we see him getting that one prolific freshman every single year. As for the past couple, we had Keontae George, then we had Jacoby Walter, and now we have VJ Edgecombe. And then combining them with a bunch of guys who have been in the program, Jaden Nunn, Langston Love, and then some transfers, Jeremy Roach and Norchad Omier, just kind of blending it all together with, youth, transfers, and now some veterans that have been in the program, really just making the group kind of blend together in a great way. And we obviously know Baylor has the great culture down there in Waco. I think they're going to be a great team. And what a matchup do we have with Baylor versus UConn December 4th. So right after those MTEs that we were talking earlier, Baylor's going to travel up to Storrs, Connecticut to play UConn. I am pumped for this matchup.
Yeah, I think Scott Drew has kind of established himself as a coach, that players want to play for. And I think we see that just every season, like you said, through transfers, and they usually get at least one, top recruit. Yeah, and so I think this is going to be another head coach battle that I'm excited to see. Just the initial game plans and the adjustments that the coaches make throughout the game and at halftime. Um, I feel like that's probably going to be a high scoring game if I know Baylor and UConn. Um, but yeah, I think this Baylor team, they're not supposed to be the best Big 12 team, but I think there's someone who can compete to be the best Big 12 team.
I agree. And last thing I'll say on Scott Drew is the trust that these players have in Scott Drew is incredible. And it's just because he's proved it time and time again. This offseason, rumored that he was linked to the Kentucky job, actually met with Kentucky representatives about that job, and then turns it down to return to Waco. I mean, if that doesn't say it, if you're turning down Kentucky to stay in Baylor, just the culture that he's built, the community that he has, and now he's able to get these great players in, I'm expecting another big year from Baylor. Just think that Scott Drew's got all the tools, he's got the players. Now it's time to go out there, perform, and obviously see where the chips fall at the end of the day.
Yeah,
And
for sure. You can definitely tell by the way his players play that they love to play for him.
100%, 100%, and they got that new arena. So obviously, it was a great view last year. Hopefully, they changed the camera angle just a little bit. Don't know if you ever watched the games, but that camera angle, I felt like I was looking straight down. So maybe they changed it a little bit. I heard reports that they were going to address that, but an exciting season for the Baylor Bears, and I think there's going to be a lot of good momentum on their side. But the last team we want to talk about are national runner-ups, the Purdue Boilermakers. What are Matt Painter and those Boilermakers going to do in the wake of Zach Edey leaving? They do have some returning players from the guard side of things, but we get a little different when we're getting up there on the post side of things. Connor, what are you seeing out of the Boilermakers this year?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think they lost their star player, in Edie, and that is just so hard to replace that kind of player. Um, but yeah, I think their two guards are probably their strength, and Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer. Um, I know we talked about Mark Sears and Alabama's backcourt. I know we talked about a couple other SEC backcourts. But honestly, I think Purdue is up there with one of the top backcourts. I
Yeah.
think they're both returning. They both average at least 10 points a game. I definitely think, in previous years they've been big man heavy. But I think this year their guards are definitely going to be the leaders. But if I'm not mistaken, isn't their center also like a 7 foot or two that they just brought in that freshman class?
Yeah, so they got Daniel Jacobson coming in as a 4-star
Yeah.
freshman, and Matt Painter does it again. He gets another 7 footer. He's going to put him right there at the center spot, and we're pulling off again. If people remember, before Zach Edey, there was a guy by the name of Isaac Haas at Purdue. He was another 7 footer. Now, he wasn't the scorer or rebounder or anything that Zach Edey was, because Zach Edey was just a generational talent in terms of college basketball big men, but he's done it. We're now on the third iteration of the 7 footer at Purdue. Matt Painter has found his niche, and he is not going away from it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely he found what works in his system, and he's sticking with it. You have to respect him for that. Um, yeah, I think obviously Purdue's weakness last year was that their guards were just not as good as UConn's were. Um, but so yeah, I'm definitely excited to see how their guards play. But I think the big thing for them though is going to be who is going to slide in at the other two spots.
Yeah, they are going to lose a lot of production without Zach Edey. I mean, Zach Edey averaged over 20 points per game, a ton of rebounds, and obviously the rebounds are going to fall to someone else now. But now we got to think who is going to take over the scoring load that Zach Edey left off. I don't think it's going to be any one person. We're going to see it as a combination of everybody. So Braden Smith last year, 12 points per game. I believe Fletcher Lawyer was around 10 points per game. Those are both going to go up, we would assume. You might see Braden Smith and Fletcher Royer now around 15, but that's only like 8 points. We still got another 12 to 15 to account for. Trey Kaufman-Wren, he played alongside Zach Edey a lot last year in the power forward position. He's back, and he's going to be better than ever this season. I can see him making the jump. And then another player, Camden Heide. He didn't get to play a lot last year because he was injured a little bit at the beginning of the season, but Camden Heide had some flashes of greatness last year. If you remember Ethan Morton, who played 2 seasons ago and then at the beginning of last year, Camden Heide was the guy that actually came in to replace him. He's the other wing. He is a great player and showed some flashes. I'm expecting some big things. He only averaged 3 points per game last year, but with more minutes and more time and the ball in his hands more, I could see him being a double-figure scorer as well. And then Daniel Jacobson, as I mentioned earlier, another 7-footer. He's going to need some time to develop. He might start at the beginning, but don't expect the production. If you remember, Zach Edey was a little rough around the edges at the beginning again as well. So, but they do have some bright spots. They have some names. And I would like what you said about this backcourt being one of the best in the nation. That would be one thing I think would be really cool that we do is actually evaluate all the different college basketball backcourts because there are so many good backcourts, and this is just another one to throw into the mix.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, I definitely think Purdue can make some noise in the Big Ten, but I think they're going to have a lot of players step up for them.
Yep, I agree. Well, anyone else you want to talk about and preview a little bit before we jump into our last segment on the pod today?
I'm not sure if you want to talk about them. It's a little painful, but since obviously it's our alma mater, I kind of want to know what your thoughts are on Oklahoma State, new coach, pretty much sounds like a new roster as well. So I kind of just want to know what your thoughts are.
Oklahoma State basketball. You got to love them, but sometimes it hurts to love. Am I right? I'm not expecting a whole lot, to be completely honest. As we all know, Big 12, best basketball conference in the nation, or at least I believe it. And so just with the team that we have, I don't know how much production we're going to get. My goal, though, is to see the flashes and to see the development for the future. So I'm understanding if we don't have the best season. I understand if we don't make the tournament, but let's just put some guys in that can develop to where, we can go on from here, from the next couple of seasons. So that's my one hope and what I'm expecting to see. But I'm not sure what coach has for us. Do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the only returning starter is going to be Bryce Thompson. Am I correct in that?
That's correct.
Which obviously Bryce Thompson was a 5-star player, originally committed to Kansas, didn't fit in well there, transferred here, been a starter, usually averages 12 to 14 points a game. Obviously the past 3 years, we haven't seen him take a big step in terms of his development. But I'm really hoping, new head coach, I'm hoping he kind of takes that step. I'm becoming the scorer he, was projected to be, the shooter that he's supposed to be. Yeah, but I will say it's probably going to be another down year. I think it's just a little hard with a new coach, a lot of your roster leaving. But who knows, maybe the year after, a couple years down the road, hopefully Oklahoma State will, get back into being in the top of the Big 12.
Yeah, I agree. Another bright spot I want to mention, Jamarion Keller. Thought he had a great end of the season last year. Really hope Steve Lutz will play him a lot more. Maybe play him as the starting point guard or 2 guard. And then another transfer that we got this year, Devontae Davis. He was previously at Arkansas. You might have heard him in some of their runs previously. He is a 5th-year senior, though, so expect to see him 1 year and he'll be done. But yeah, hoping that we use this as a development year, as a springboard to these next couple of seasons to where we can get back to where we belong and competing in the Big 12.
All right, well.
Yeah, go ahead.
All this college basketball talk has kind of got me thinking. So I kind of want to throw out a question. We've pretty much we've talked about all these teams except for one today. So my question is, if you could inherit like one college basketball program to be the head coach of, who would it be and why? And so some blue bloods, obviously Duke, UNC, Kentucky, Kansas, UConn. We've talked about Indiana. I know they haven't been good in a long time, but also I'm going to throw out UCLA. You know, they have an absurd number of championships. Obviously, not one recently, but they've had some good teams recently. So I'm just trying to, I kind of want to know what you're like. Who would you want to be the coach of right now?
Well, obviously, I want to be the coach of the Oklahoma State Cowboys. Go Pokes, am I right? No, but if we're talking about blue bloods, um, man, this is a tough question. I think for me personally, it would have been UCLA. It actually would have been UCLA. But now that the Pac 12 has died and has gone down to the Pac 2 and they've joined the Big Ten, I don't really want to touch that. I don't want to be living in LA, commuting all the way over to Ohio and Michigan and all of that. So I'll leave the UCLA and Big Ten for someone else. But I think if I could inherit one college basketball program to be the head coach of, it would have to be Kansas. I think just Fog Allen, Allen Fieldhouse, just all of that is just so iconic. Dr. James Naismith was there. We got Bill Self now. All of the great players that have played there. Just the history behind it. I know all these blue bloods have history, but there's just something about Kansas basketball. And growing up in the Big 12 country, Kansas just has always been that team. And even though there were times where I hated them, I've learned to respect them and just can't imagine what the Big 12 would look like without him because honestly, they've kept us relevant at times when the Big 12 has been down. I just think the Kansas Jayhawks would be a fun team to coach. It was a close second with Duke. I love Duke, and I think that'd be a fun team to coach as well and be a part of. But I just think the program and the atmosphere that Kansas brings. Obviously, with their football coming up now, we're just in a great period for the University of Kansas. And I think I'd want to be a part of it. But I'll pose the question back to you: which school or which program would you want to be the head coach of?
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I had a very similar top two, except mine were flipped. I think I'm gonna go with Duke. Um, Obviously, they weren't relevant until Coach K got there. You know, no one really batted an eye at Duke. Whereas, I think Kansas still, was a relevant team back then. Um, but man, how many you don't want to play in that arena, especially for a Duke UNC game? Have all the
Goosebumps.
crazies just yelling, man. Um, Sold out crowds. Um, Obviously, they've had success, a couple championships since 2010, 2015. Obviously, Coach K won a couple more before that. Um, but yeah, I think they're also something that drew me to them is that they're probably arguably the most hated team in college basketball. And I think I would just love rubbing how good my team is in everyone's face. It just being like, you can hate all you want. We're winning 27 games per year, you know?
Yeah. I that would definitely be a fun one to be a part of. I think the only thing about Duke that holds me back is, and John Shire's done a great job, but just being behind Coach K and the greatness and the aura that comes with who he is and who he was as a basketball coach. But that we kind of get that with all of these teams, right? But that one would just be a tough act to follow up. But that would be a great one. Cameron Indoor is on the bucket list, one of the places I'd love to visit. So I could definitely see it and would be a fun one to be a part of.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Coach K, to me, he's my favorite coach of all time. I'm not sure if you've read any of his books, but yes, he's like one of the best coaches, but he truly, cared about the players, outside of just basketball. And I think it showed the way they played for him and the way that everyone loved him. Um, Even when he was coaching Team USA, I think those players loved playing with him there. Obviously, I was sad to see him retire, but outstanding coach, outstanding person. Um, but yeah, Kansas was a close second for the reasons you listed, though.
Yeah. No, I think definitely 1 and 2 for me as well. So that's cool to see. But anything else you wanted to talk about real quick before we hop off the pod in this episode?
Now, Yeah, I'm excited for all these tournaments. I'm excited for college basketball. Like I said, love college basketball, love the atmosphere, love the passion that the players are playing with. Um, and I think it should be a pretty exciting season. I don't think there's a clear cut, just number one team, this year.
Yeah, 100%. I'm excited to be covering it alongside you all the way to one shining moment at the end of the year. But before we jump off, just want to say shout out to everyone that is still listening to the podcast. Thank you so much for your support. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, please, if you're watching on YouTube, drop a like, subscribe, turn on the bell notifications so you can get reminders every single time that we're posting. We try and do this once a week, and it's just been really fun to do and excited to continue to covering it all with you all. And then if you're on any of the podcast platforms, make sure to give us a 5-star rating. Leave a comment both on YouTube and the podcast. Let us know what you want to hear. We'd love to hear your feedback and love to talk more with you all. But I think that's all for me. And for Connor, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Courtside. Peace.